If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Hey there, Equity Warriors. Today I welcome Dr. K, Robyn Koslowitz. Robyn, I forgot. Did I pronounce your last name properly?
You did, correct.
Okay, all right. So, Edward, starting over. In 5, 4, 3. Hey there, Equity Warriors. Today, I welcome Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, a nationally recognized expert in childhood trauma and resilience. With her forthcoming book, Post-Traumatic Parenting, Dr. K empowers parents to transform their own traumas into resilience, benefiting their children. Having positively impacted over 2,400 families, her insights are invaluable. So stay tuned today for some practical strategies to decode trauma, build resilience, and foster effective communication, a common theme we've talked about here on the 3E podcast. You will not want to miss one word of today's conversation. Dr. K, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Barry. I'm very excited to have this conversation.
Well, I am too, because I think I shared with you in our pre-call, I was a child of trauma. So, anytime I can get as an adult more information to help pass on to other parents who can intercept, I'm excited to be able to share that. I always ask folks to give us your version of your bio, a pivotal moment in your life, what has shaped you to what you are and what you do today. Anything you want to share that I didn't read in that abbreviated bio.
So like you, I was a child of trauma, and I think my story is somewhat hard to hear. So for people who don't need that energy, just know that it's a little difficult to hear. So I actually lost my father when I was a young child. My father had very severe heart disease, so I witnessed many heart attacks, many emergencies. When I was 16, I actually performed CPR on my father, and he did not make it. When I was 16, it was way before anyone was talking about trauma. So I developed PTSD, but I had no idea that there was anything called PTSD. So I thought I was mentally ill. I thought that I was hearing voices that no one could hear and seeing things no one else could see. Not a good sign for your mental health. Even when you're not a mental health professional, you kind of know that as a kid.
Yeah.
So I was sort of suffering in silence with my PTSD. But on the surface, I looked fine as a kid. I was getting great grades. I was involved in extracurriculars. In college, I was holding down a job while going to college and, dual majoring, looked fine, but I knew that I had PTSD. And then I became a mom, and I realized that my trauma my damage is going to damage my kids unless I do something about it.
Yeah.
That's what became the book.
Wow. I recently read, well, I guess not so recently now, it's been a couple of years, a book called My Grandmother's Hands. I don't know if you've heard it before, but it was where I was introduced to understanding that trauma is literally transmitted through the womb and passed down from generation to generation. And the studies that were done on descendants of Holocaust victims, on African Americans who are descended from enslaved peoples, and how that trauma, even though it may not have happened to us specifically, but our responses to it have been transmitted. So it just, I applaud and feel your story. My childhood trauma was also with my father, but, slightly different. But I think much like you, and I didn't become a therapist, but I understood at some point in time that was messing with my head in ways that I didn't understand. And like you, an excellent student and doing well. I was partying a lot in college, but I managed to finish on time still. It's like, had a lot of fun, but I still finished on time. High school, I was a great student.
Oh, to be 21 again, right?
Well, Only if I also have the knowledge about life in the world that I do now. Would I want to be
Right.
21 again? Yeah,
Yeah.
21, but with wisdom would be great. I want to talk about understanding childhood trauma in terms of how it impacts or affects a developing mind and maybe some impacts on behavior, either short term or long term. What can you share?
So first of all, trauma is any experience that's too big for your brain to metabolize, because people very often get hung up on like, what is the technical definition? Is that traumatic? If your brain couldn't metabolize it, then that was
Yeah.
trauma. And I think it's important to know that, because very often trauma is not necessarily what happened to you, it's what didn't happen for you. And for me, for example, having a very ill father made me different than the other children in my class, and it made me very dissociated. It made me very cerebral, and that made me a target for bullies, right? And
Yeah.
when my father was very ill, the other children didn't know how to talk to me. They were uncomfortable, and when kids are uncomfortable, they just kind of edit you out of existence, which makes you
Yeah.
a bigger target for bullies. And I can't say necessarily that losing my father was more or less traumatic than being bullied, right? They
Yeah.
both were traumatic. They opened the door
Yeah.
to each other in many ways. So it's important, because sometimes people talk about this myth of like big T versus little t trauma. And I think that that's such a fallacy to think about. If something was too big for you to metabolize, you're traumatized. I would rather think of like ACESs, right? Adverse childhood experiences, the famous study where we talk about like having a parent be incarcerated, having a parent die, living in poverty, living in a dangerous neighborhood. And then there's secret ACESs, the things that people might not know about you or your family. Being parented by a functional alcoholic, being
Mhm.
parented very harshly, living in a home where there's food insecurity, but they're kind of making it on the surface, right? Where
Yeah.
no one would know, right? No one knows that
Right.
this family
Right.
is
Not
barely
unless
getting
you
through the
tell.
month until you
Yeah.
tell. Yeah.
Wow. I love your definition. I want to state that again. Trauma is anything that your brain cannot metabolize. I
Yes.
think that so simplifies something that I never really, it's like I understood I was traumatized, but I didn't understand that until I was an adult. But I couldn't tell you what that meant other than to know that there were things that were said when I was a child. Such minor things that people probably didn't think anything about, and they weren't microaggressions. But if someone would ask me, so what does your father do? Right?
Right.
I didn't have a father.
Yeah.
And that while that's much more common in the 2000s in the current century, I can tell you that in the 1970s, I was really abnormal. Right,
Yeah.
everybody had two parents at home, but I didn't.
Yeah.
And why, that someone would ask that question, and I would just cry. Right there, I couldn't do it. I couldn't go to a funeral until I was 40 something again,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
processing, thank you. It's like I've had a free therapy session. I love
Yeah.
it. Even though I've had plenty of therapy and as an adult in coming to grips with what all of that was. So when our kids, it could be something that's very minor, right?
Right.
That traumatizes just because their brains can't handle it.
Yeah. And that's
Wow.
important, because it's not necessarily what happens, right? It's who it happens
It's,
to and how it
yeah,
lands that really
yeah,
matters.
yeah. And it's because some people are much more resilient. That the same event at the same age as their peer has may not impact them the same way.
Yeah. But resilience to me is a little bit of a tricky word. I know we use
Okay.
it a lot with the book, because sometimes you can be skin deep resilient, right? Like I was an
Mhm.
any measure a resilient kid. I call it being a duck, like over the surface, the duck is floating serenely, but under the
Yeah.
surface, you're paddling madly to keep up. So I
Gotcha.
like to look beyond resilience to fortitude, because resilience is just you bounce back. Right.
Okay.
And okay, so this happened and the kid seems fine. And you'd be
Yeah.
surprised. Kids can go through horrific things and show up in school and you wouldn't necessarily know. Right. You look at their faces
Yeah.
and they're all like smiling in second grade and they just look like regular
Yeah.
kids. You don't know. It's not written on their face. That's sort of what we look at as resilience. But I like to look at fortitude, the idea that you have the real psychological capacity to handle what life throws your way. because
Wow.
you can appear resilient on the surface. I feel like
Yeah.
I've had a lot of friends and a lot of post-traumatic parenting community members who come in and people will praise their resilience and like, whoa,
Mhm.
you're so resilient. You immigrated to this country and you had no money and you were discriminated against. Like you had all these experiences and then you made yourself, and that's like very much
Yeah.
the 1980s, like, saga. But what did it
Right.
cost you? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Fortitude is what we build with wisdom in adulthood.
Huh. I like that.
Yeah.
I'm learning a lot. I like it when I'm learning a lot.
This is for me, this was my life. This was my life's journey and my life's work,
Yeah.
and it always bothered me when I would work in schools. I consult in a lot of schools and we do a lot of like anti-bullying curricula.
Mhm.
I do a lot of helping teachers deal with kids who we know are traumatized in the classroom. And a lot of times teachers will be like, but she's so resilient. Like, okay, so she bounced back. And how do we get her moving forward?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You have me thinking, although even though I've been out of the classroom for what year is this? I've been out of the classroom now for 21 years. As a classroom teacher, I think about some kids who, I could see sometimes that there was something wrong.
Yeah.
My population of children were my school was located adjacent to and sort of in, depending on which side you were on, a federal housing project. So all my kids were children of low income. Many of them were immigrant and migrant children. All of them, I always say with one exception, one year, were Black. They were Latina. They were Southeast Asian. They were a marginalized group of children to begin with. I did not, even though this was the town I grew up in, it was not the neighborhood I grew up in. And I did not understand until I stayed at work really late one day and my custodian came in and said, you have to leave. And I was like, but I still have work to do. And he said, no, things are going to change around here.
Yeah.
I'm going to walk you to your car. You have to go. I did not consider the lived experiences of my children being in a neighborhood where once the sun went down, that bullets were flying, that it wasn't safe for them to come out. And as even I didn't know how do I take that into what I do with them while they're in my classroom? How is this impacting the way they receive instruction, what they're taking away from that classroom experience? Now, I had sixth graders, but I'm wondering if you can share with us, are there signs that we can look for that might tell us that a child is experiencing trauma?
So here's the thing. It's not looking for the signs of trauma because trauma very often doesn't happen in the past. It happens in the future. Sometimes the impact of something hits years later. You're teaching about the cardiovascular system and there's a kid whose dad was shot through the heart, right? Or who had a heart attack and suddenly it hits, right? You don't know. So what I'd rather do rather than looking for the signs of trauma, and some of us, by the way, especially traumatized kids like myself, are very good at hiding it because we know that people don't want to really know, or we think we're crazy and we don't want anyone to know that. Instead, what I like to do is give mechanisms for kids to talk to us, to tell us that, you know what, that was triggering. And this is like right in the world, there's all these like thoughts of like trigger warnings as though we're raising snowflakes and like this is the worst thing ever, as opposed to a trigger warning simply being, be prepared. We're about to talk about something that may make some of you get catapulted back into a state of fight or flight. You might be very scared or you might be frozen. So if you give yourself a moment to gather up your fortitude, you're going to be fine. So I'm going to give you that trigger warning. And for the child to be able to communicate that to us. Like I'm working in a classroom right now, consulting with a teacher, and the teacher has kind of an old school mentality. And there are some traumatized kids in the classroom. And I taught her about the idea of having a safe space for kids to go if they're feeling overwhelmed, but she was worried kids would abuse it. So I said, what if we made a system where we're in her class, we're calling it 911, 811, 711. She chose that metaphor. There's many metaphors that you can use, but the idea is emergency. I must talk to you, teacher, right now, versus gotta talk to you within the, 2-hour period of today, like before recess or after recess or whatever, versus by the end of the week, I need to tell you something. And the kids have the signal system. So now there's one child in particular who was very traumatized by something that happened in her own life. And the most unpredictable things trigger her. But when she has a 911 and she could raise like that one finger versus the two fingers, whatever the teacher is doing, to be able to tell the teacher, like, I'm really sad right now. It's golden because it takes a second. The teacher acknowledges it. She can go to the back of the room, compose herself, and come back. There's no disruption to the lesson. And think of the fortitude she's building. The tears are rising. I'm about to cry. So when I came into this classroom day one, she was sitting in class with tears just silently falling down her face. Third grader, humiliated because everyone's staring at her because she is so traumatized and so upset about something. But her parents have this philosophy that she needs to be in school and tough it out and figure it out. And they're like not really understanding that that might cause more harm than good. So here we have this little girl sitting there crying all day. And the teacher first saying to me like, oh, that sounds like we're creating snowflakes or whatever, versus now where when she needs to cry, she can go, she can take a break, she can calm down. She comes back tear-free a couple of minutes later. And very often now it's 811. She'll raise two fingers. And then when she goes to the teacher, she says, this is making me think of the person. I don't want to break anybody's confidentiality. So this is making me think of the person who died, whatever the teacher said. And this is why. And then the teacher can be like, yeah, that was sad. That's hard. I'm proud of you for calming yourself down and coming back. And the kid feels so free. And we went from tears all day to the occasional tears to the occasional break. And we're only like a couple of weeks into school. Like it's September. We started second week of September. We're like, and this is fortitude, right? This kid, we're not creating a snowflake. This is a kid who respects her body's signals, can manage them, and went from crying every day to a couple of tears because she's managing it and she's processing it. Right? So there's such a progression here.
Yeah.
Think about how safe that is.
Yeah, I just, that's something, gosh, and I wish I had that information when I wrote my last book, because I would have inserted that in there as one of the things that we can do in classrooms and making our classrooms safe spaces. But I think, as an adult, we, typically, I don't know, maybe it's not typically, but we recognize when we feel things, but we have the ability often to escape, where children are, for lack of a better term, basically held hostage in a classroom. Yeah. They cannot just get up and walk away. They can't say, excuse me, I need to go to the restroom and walk out of a meeting, or I have to take this phone call, whatever it is, the excuse we might make up to escape from a situation. Our children are locked into their seats and they don't have that freedom. What you shared, I think, is something that every teacher who hears this episode can take and implement in their classroom to some degree, just for kids to recognize when they need that time and space. And very often educators do, if it's a child that's on an IEP or a 504 plan, it's something that's written in there. But what about the vast majority of kids who don't have the protections of a 504 or an IEP? And I think also, Doc, about in Black and Brown communities, how mental health is still sort of poo-pooed. Right. Yeah. We don't need that. So for educators to be able to do something is very helpful. Is that system something that parents could use at home in some way? Is there an adaptation for that?
So my adaptation for that is that parents, you can't always, get a kid to open up, right? Everyone's like, how do I get my kid to open up? What you can do is schedule times when you're available, when you and the kid are doing something sort of low engagement but soothing, like let's say every day or every few days, where if something's going to come up, that's when it's going to come up. Maybe you take a walk together. Maybe you do the weekly shopping together. Maybe you do a puzzle together. You cook together, like a shoulder to shoulder activity where the child knows. And during that time, you're not listening to a show and you're not on the phone with somebody else. So the child has in their head, oh, that's when my mom or dad is available. That's the time to bring this up. And very often they'll bring it up like at the very last leg of that walk, right? Or just as you're leaving the store, right? And that you have to, more than like, how will I know, how will I get my child to open up? It's like the open up happened, catch it, right?
Yeah,
I had, Mom. Okay, let's talk.
Yeah, it always comes at the most inopportune time, right? Yeah. I had a guest on recently, a few episodes, but probably about 10 episodes back now, who talked about having you time right? And it was just that time for each child that you designate that, even if you're just, like you said, playing a card game or watching TV or doing a puzzle or whatever, that child knows that's their time. And it may be that if you incorporate something like that from his recommendations, and it's just during that you time, if it's the last 10 seconds of you time, you extend that time until the child has the opportunity. Oh, I love this.
By the way, you can also say to a child, I've actually taught my kids, it's because of like the nature of me sometimes associating. Everyone in my family knows to say, are you available? So sometimes I might say at the end, I call it special time, but at the end of special time, I might say, this sounds like an important conversation, but I also have to like sort of respect my own body and my own needs. If let's say it's my bedtime and I don't want to do this right now because I don't have my full brain, you're not getting the best of me, you're getting the rest of me. This sounds important. Let's write an appointment card for when we're going to discuss it. I don't want to give you like a real fast yes or no. This sounds like something I want my full brain to listen to. So tomorrow, right when you come home from school, let's table it till then, and then we're going to talk about it. Then the kid feels like, wow, you really want to hear what I have to say without me pretending, but really I'm dissociating. Really, I'm half asleep. Like my full brain's not there. And I get that I've got to listen with my whole entire body right now. So you can also honor your own neurology and say, totally get that we have to talk about this. Here's when we're going to do that.
That is awesome. And I'm assuming that these are all tips that come from your book, Post-Traumatic Parenting.
Yes.
And we're going to make sure that there's a link to that book in the notes for this episode, because I think even if you are not a parent, if you're not parenting post a known trauma, so to speak, that it's just good parenting information to have. I think there are some books that, as you have to get a license, you have to study to drive a car, but nobody makes you study to become a parent.
Yeah.
So one of those books that should be on the bookshelf of everyone about to become a parent or that is a parent. So you work with schools.
Yeah.
You work with families.
Really, what I tried to do very much is I tried to be the adult I would have needed when I was a kid. So yeah, I work with post-traumatic parents, helping them not allow their damage to damage their kids. And I always say, like, after COVID, we're all post-traumatic parents to a certain extent. I don't think anyone comes into adulthood unscathed. No. I certainly, and I treat children directly. At this point, I work more with parents than with kids. Like I have a lot of associates in my practice who actually treat children, unless children are very traumatized